Hey everyone, this is D, Movieman, fellow cinephile, popcorn addict, and emerging film critic, coming to you with reliable recaps, reviews, and reactions. And today I'm coming to you all with something that is just a little bit overdue.
I'm late for a very important date. No time to say hello, goodbye. I'm late.
That is none other than my general commentary / ranking on the films I got to see at the Sundance Film Festival in Salt Lake City, Utah. So, the first thing I have to say is that this is an experience that has been in the making for the past 3 years, actually. If you guys have not yet watched or checked out my review for Passing, please feel free to do that because it was actually my first experience with Sundance, like in person. Of course, with the Ponderosa going on, it was a drive-in world premiere at the Plaza Theater. I got a chance to actually visit the theater, and it was such a unique thing to experience, and I think it came around at the right time. And then, of course, as time went on, having the experience of purchasing films and watching them virtually and just seeing how Sundance works. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Sundance Film Festival, as I wasn't at one point, let me first say that Sundance is an annual film festival that is organized by the Sundance Institute. It's a nonprofit organization founded by the actor Robert Redford, committed to the growth of independent artists. Their goal is to discover and support independent filmmakers, theater artists, producers, composers, and more from all over the world. It was officially established in 1981, which means that now, in 2024, it has been in operation for 43 years. So the fact that it's we have voices that need to be heard, we have stories that need to be told and seen by others, not just in the US, but also internationally, not just narrative features, but also documentaries, not even just, feature-length films, but also short films. So it's just they really have covered all their bases. And I think that's what I respect about Sundance the most, and what has really made me so appreciative, of having this experience. Not only am I getting to see, really unique, interesting films, but I'm supporting the voices of people who otherwise, may not have had an opportunity to be seen or be heard or, had their films and stories put out there. So yes, Sundance, kudos to them. And I'm just so thankful for what they do, what they've done, and what they'll continue to do going forward. So, in all, I saw 18 films.
Damn!
I know. But, I still had a great experience. Was it a lot? Yes. Slightly overwhelming to an extent, but it was also a blast. It was kind of like getting on a roller coaster. It's just whoa, wow. But then, when it's over, it's man, I did that. You know what I'm saying? I did the thing.
Angela Bassett did the thing.
So with that being said, I'm just giving my general thoughts and just know that some of these probably maybe could kind of go up one, go down one. I'll just say this. The ones that were further down, it's for a reason. And I still, of course, I think we know, I hope we know, some of you may not know, that film is subjective. So I also realize that my experience with some of these films may be very, very different for some people. So, without further ado, let me get into my ranking for the 18, yes, the 18 films I saw at Sundance. At number 18, unsurprisingly, if you recently saw my review that I dropped for it, we have The American Society of Magical Negroes, written, directed, and co-produced by Kobi Libii. This film is just such a joke. You know what I'm saying? It's just who, where, when, why, how. It's at the bottom for a reason. If you haven't seen my review, check it out. Outside of that, we can move on. At number 17, we have Sebastian, written and directed by Mikko. Mäkelä. So this film is centered around a young man named Max, who is a 25-year-old aspiring writer living in London, who decides to create a piece that involves him living a double life as a man of the night, shall we say, in order to research and create his debut novel. I'm not upset at what the film was trying to do or even what the story was trying to portray, because I do think there are a lot of layers to that experience and to that profession. But a lot of this film just felt like an excuse to have very over-the-top, in-your-face, intimate sequences, shall we say. And even that would be one thing, but I think outside of that, the story itself and even the main character of Max was so hollow that at the end of it was just kind of like, what are we doing here? And I also think that it was missing a lot of layers. Like, I think it would have been interesting if this was a character who was very uncomfortable with their sexuality, or was someone who was very withdrawn, didn't really date, didn't really, venture out, hadn't had a lot of intimate, encounters, or maybe was, I don't know, maybe there was some fluidity as far as the sexuality, or maybe, I don't know. There was something so flat about it, and it just became awkward to watch. It was just like, is there really a purpose to this outside of this character just getting it in with these various people? Like, you understand after a certain point, like, how it ties into his aspirations as a writer, but it's just like, what does that do to you mentally? And I think the film really wasted an opportunity to really delve into the psyche of someone who was dealing with that, especially when it's not your actual profession. Like, what does that mean? What does that suggest? What are the dangers of that? You know what I'm saying? I think that would have been more intriguing. As someone who has watched films like Lust, Caution, there are ways with intense sexuality and with those depictions to flesh something out story-wise. But here, it just felt like an excuse for flesh, to be seen on screen. I'm like, maybe that's fun for some folks, but for me, it's just kind of like, womp womp. Womp womp womp. But I have to say, the biggest surprise for me was seeing Jonathan Hyde in this film. I am not going to spoil his role. I had no idea he was in this film. And as someone who obviously grew up watching him in plenty of classic roles, in the 90s and as a kid, this was different. It was different, but I felt like his performance had the kind of vulnerability and depth that Max and the film as a whole lacked. So when it came down to it, it was just like, yeah, you tried, but I honestly could have done without this. All right, at number 16, we have In the Summers, written and directed by Alessandra Lacorazza. This was actually a film that won the Grand Jury Prize for the U.S. Dramatic Competition at the festival. This, of course, is Alessandra's feature directorial debut, and it is a semi-autobiographical story. It's centered around two sisters, Eva and Violetta, as they navigate their very complicated and fractured relationship with their father, and we see the progression of that throughout the years as they continue to grow older and understand just how complicated that relationship is with a father who seems to love them, but also just is not quite where he needs to be as a parent. And what I appreciated was the frankness and the honesty of this film. I think, of course, there are plenty of people, unfortunately, who can relate to the subject matter. And I thought it was something very unique as someone who, of course, has visited family during the summers and have had great experiences. It was really something to see how these siblings tried their best to make sense of their very dysfunctional relationship with their father, and what does that mean for their development and the future. I do think that as a slice of life type of film, it gets very drawn out. And I'm someone who appreciates a slower pace, but sometimes it can be like pulling gum. And there are moments I was just like, all right, okay. And I think what made that worse is that there's not a lot of dialogue. And let's be clear, I appreciate showing and not telling. And I think there's something to be said about the impact of characters interacting with each other in nonverbal ways. But I also want to understand a little bit more through dialogue. And because I'm just a dialogue person, I enjoy having conversations. to me, it's sometimes interesting to see, like, what are we saying? How do these characters see each other? And I think there were wasted opportunities to explore that. I just think that a lot of it kind of plods along and it wants us to kind of fill in the dots, fill in the gaps, which is okay. But sometimes it can feel like, we're just kind of along for the ride, but I'm ready to get off. So I think overall, I appreciated it, but I do think there were a lot of wasted opportunities here. Up next, we have I Saw the TV Glow, written and directed by James Schoenbrun, and starring Justice Smith. I think this is one that's going to divide the audience. I've already seen that A24 has picked this one up, and we already know A24 is already a studio that divides a lot of audiences anyway. I guess maybe just based off of the synopsis, which kind of has to do with this teenager named Owen, whose view of reality becomes very fractured as he develops this obsession and fascination with this 90s TV show. And I think what I appreciated, I should say, the most about it was how it does delve into our idea of nostalgia and the things we connect with, the things we attach ourselves to, and how that shapes our upbringing. I liked how unsettling it was, and I like that it was a different perception of horror. It's not horror, of course, in the typical sense. It might be considered elevated horror, which some folks I know cannot stand, but I think there were intriguing ideas here. Did it come together for me? No. Now, I do think it's one I may have to revisit to fully appreciate, and that's fine. Between this and Magical Negroes, I do think Justice Smith gives a better performance here, but am I sold on him as an actor?
No.
Like I said, I think this is going to be a film similar to Skinamarink, where you either love it or you hate it. It's either brilliant or it's a waste of time. I won't say it was a complete waste of time, but it did not give me what I thought it was going to. So I may have to circle back around later and see, and say like, maybe I was wrong, or maybe it just ain't changing. But for now, yeah, that's all I have to say on this one. Okay, up next we have Suncoast, written and directed by Laura Chinn, also in her feature directorial debut, and starring Laura Linney, Nico Parker, and Woody Harrelson. So this is another semi-autobiographical coming-of-age story, which deals with a young woman coming into her own while dealing with her brother's illness and, forming this very unusual relationship with an eccentric activist and just dealing with some very unexpected upheaval in her relationship with her mother. And I have to say, there were a lot of films in the festival that dealt with coming of age and adolescence, and I appreciated it, but it was like, man, it really kind of hit me because I'm someone who obviously has very fond views of childhood and coming of age, but it sometimes can conflict with the reality of being an adult. And so seeing so many films that were centered around that, it was like, man, this is really hitting home in a lot of ways. But as far as the film, I think Laura Linney is always solid. She does a great job of really developing and navigating this very complicated, tragic, and frustrating character. I also have to give kudos to Nico Parker. She actually won the Breakthrough Performance Award in the U.S. dramatic competition, and she absolutely deserved it. I was already familiar with her as Tandiwe Newton's daughter, and she had already made an appearance in Dumbo, which I will say was not quite where it needed to be, but I think Dumbo as a film was not where it needed to be, and the whole thing really did make for an odd experience. But seeing Nico in this, you can see the growth and the progression, and I'm really, really proud of her. She really brought it, and of course, going toe-to-toe with Laura Linney, like, she really held her own. So I think this film was one I appreciated. It was refreshing in some ways because for it to be coming of age, it didn't fall into the usual stereotypes that you see when it comes to friend groups and peer pressure and all that. It was a little bit more well-rounded. I think they could have gone further with that. I think it was missing something for me. I also enjoy Woody Harrelson, but his character and the dynamic of his character felt out of place. And I just think it made the film more muddled than it needed to be. All in all, I think just generally a fairly positive experience, but just not as high on my list as some other films. Okay, next up we have Handling the Undead, aka Antering av Udada, co-written and directed by Thea Hvistendahl, and also co-written by Jon Ajvide Lindqvist, and also starring Renate Reinsve from The Worst Person in the World. So this film takes place in Oslo, Norway, and it is centered around three families whose world is thrown for a loop when the dead suddenly awaken, and they have to now deal with the ramifications of, as the title says, handling the undead. What I did like about this is that it was such a different, in a way, it was a somewhat different idea of what the undead looks like. I mean, we see films about zombies and how that might play out, but this kind of takes a little bit of a different approach to it. It is definitely a slow burn, and it doesn't take your typical horror approach. So I think if you liked or disliked something like You Won't Be Alone, which I absolutely loved, this may or may not be for you. You Won't Be Alone was a little bit more impactful from the emotional side of things. In the end, I felt the message, especially pertaining to the ending, was something I had already seen handled and fleshed out in a far more resonant way in Pet Sematary. And by that, I mean the book written by Stephen King. I was actually shocked by how impactful that story was regarding loss, grief, and what we'll sometimes do to bring ourselves out of that, and our idea of playing God and changing the rules to bring back the person that we so desperately want to keep in our lives as a part of our lives. And I felt like when it came down to the end, it was just like, I've seen a far more layered and complex version of this, even for people who probably don't think Stephen King is that complex of a writer or a storyteller. That story was impactful, and I just felt like this in comparison was just like, eh. Up next, we have Love Me, written and directed by Sam and Andy Zuchero in their feature directorial debuts, and starring Kristen Stewart and Stephen Yeun. Honestly, I kind of found this to be a new age version of WALL-E. Like, I just kept thinking that the more I watched it. What I can say is that the film is at its strongest in its first act, when it is centered around the early stages of this burgeoning relationship between the satellite and the buoy, and how they communicate and what they then begin to understand about life and the world and humanity and identity. As it goes along, it gets more rudimentary. Like, it gets very kind of like, all right, we've seen kind of these ideas about the existential crisis as it comes to technology and humanity and all that. And it's like, I thought it was cool, but as it went along, it was just like, this doesn't quite have the same kind of impact that that first act did. And it gets a lot more muddled and a lot more like, you know, it just kind of starts to lose its impact as we go along. Now, I do think Kristen Stewart and Stephen Yeun did a great job as far, performance-wise. But I think this is one that would have been way more impactful as a short film, just centered around that first act. All right, now we have Kneecap, written and directed by Rich Peppiatt, which is a film describing the rise of the Belfast-based hip-hop trio Kneecap, which stars the band members of Kneecap as themselves. I have to say, this one was surprising. I don't know what I was expecting from this, but I was not expecting something centered around Irish hip-hop at all. What I can say is that it was just very quirky and very in your face and just very intense, and it was definitely not what I was expecting. But I think what I appreciated most was the concept of culture and community and identity as it relates to language, and the idea of assimilation. It's just like, as we go on and we're expected to forget these customs, forget our history. And in this case, we're referring to the Irish Gaelic language. And that was something I realized I had no idea about. Same thing with, the Welsh language, and just a lot of languages, overseas that, you don't necessarily think about or have the experience or the knowledge to understand. And so I think that was the strongest part of this. As far as what it is and what it's saying, I actually did appreciate it. It is definitely a R-rated, over the top, in your face, Shocker. So I think overall it definitely kept me entertained, if nothing else. All right, now we have In the Land of Brothers, directed by Raha Amirfazli and Alireza Ghasemi. This won the award for directing in the World Cinema Dramatic Competition. It tells the story of an extended Afghan family and their experience as they start their lives over in Iran as refugees. Given their nationality and ethnicity, we then understand what that means for them as they attempt to discover what home is, discovering what that looks like in a place where they technically don't belong, and what that means for the progression of their family over these years. And I love a film, any story that has to deal with a family saga and, just the passage of time and how the generations of a family, seemingly move along. Now, this isn't necessarily a generational story. It is, but it isn't. It's not like, hundreds of years, but it is showing throughout the decades how this family is shaped by these unfortunate circumstances. And it was something that was chilling, it was poignant, and it was a tough watch, but I also appreciated the insight into the Afghan experience as it's something I've heard of, but it changes a little bit and you have a greater appreciation when it's so personal. And again, this is another appreciation that I have for Sundance in bringing stories like this to life. So it's not one that is easy, it's not even entertainment, but it's not an easy watch, but it was one that definitely was compelling. And it just is a reminder of what the reality for many of us who, are not American, or many people out there who are not American, what that can look like, especially from the perspective of the refugee experience.